Tonight, there is nowhere you need to be. No task waiting for your attention. No decision that must be made before morning. For the next little while, allow yourself to slow down. Take a gentle breath. Let your shoulders relax. And imagine, if you will, that we are leaving behind the noise of the modern world. The sound of engines, the endless notifications, the crowded streets, the constant feeling that we must always be moving toward the next thing. Instead, we are traveling backward, far backward, across oceans, across centuries, more than 2,400 years into the past. Our destination is a city unlike any other. Athens, the heart of ancient Greece. As the first light of morning begins to illuminate the hills, the city slowly awakens. Merchants begin arranging baskets filled with olives, figs, fresh bread, and clay pottery. Craftsmen open the wooden doors of their workshops. Children run through narrow stone streets. The distant sound of hammers echoes softly against marble walls. The air carries the scent of olive oil, fresh herbs, dust warmed by the Mediterranean sun, and the sea that surrounds much of this remarkable land. This is not a quiet city. Athens is alive with conversation, politics, poetry, trade, religion, art. Every corner seems filled with debate. Every citizen seems to have an opinion. And perhaps nowhere is this more visible than in the agora, the marketplace. But calling it simply a marketplace would hardly do it justice. Yes, people come here to buy food, to sell pottery, to exchange goods. But they also come here to exchange something far more valuable: ideas. The agora is the beating heart of Athenian life. Politicians argue before curious crowds. Young students gather around respected teachers. Travelers bring stories from distant lands. Poets recite verses. Generals discuss war. The farther we travel into the past, the more carefully we must separate evidence from tradition. Throughout this journey together, whenever uncertainty exists, we will acknowledge it. Because one of the greatest lessons Socrates leaves us is the importance of intellectual honesty. Sometimes, the most truthful answer is simply, we cannot know for certain. Long before Socrates was born, the Greek world had already produced remarkable thinkers. Some searched for the basic substance from which everything was made. Was it water? Fire? Air? Something else entirely? Others looked toward the stars, the planets, the seasons, the hidden order of nature. These early philosophers transformed mythology into rational inquiry. Instead of asking what the gods desired, they began asking how nature itself worked. It was one of humanity's greatest intellectual revolutions. But Socrates would quietly change the direction of philosophy itself. Rather than asking, "What is the universe made of?" he asked, "What kind of person should I become?" Instead of studying distant stars, he turned his attention toward the human soul, toward our choices, our beliefs, our character, our everyday lives. This simple shift changed philosophy forever. For Socrates believed that understanding ourselves was far more urgent than understanding the heavens. After all, every decision we make, every friendship we build, Every injustice we commit, every act of kindness, comes not from the stars, but from the human heart. And perhaps that is why his ideas still feel astonishingly modern. The world around us has changed beyond anything he could have imagined. The buildings, the technology, the languages, the nations. Yet the questions remain remarkably familiar. How should we live? Why do people deceive themselves? Can someone truly know what is right? What is happiness? Can wisdom be taught? Ordinary citizens question one another about justice, law, virtue, and the meaning of living well. It is difficult to imagine today a city where philosophy was not hidden away inside universities, but spoken aloud beneath the open sky, where ordinary people stopped in the street, not to argue about celebrities or tomorrow's weather, but to ask, what is courage? What is justice? What makes someone truly good? These questions were not considered strange. They were part of everyday life. And among all these voices, one man quietly stood apart. He did not wear expensive robes. He possessed no great fortune. He held no political office. He did not claim to possess secret knowledge. In fact, he often insisted that he knew very little. At first glance, many people might not have noticed him at all. Ancient writers describe him as rather unusual in appearance. Short, broad, with a flat nose, prominent eyes, and simple clothing. He often walked barefoot through the streets of Athens. Nothing about his appearance suggested greatness. Yet countless people stopped to speak with him. Young men followed him through the city. Generals respected him. Politicians feared him. Writers immortalized him. And philosophers, for more than 2,000 years, have continued discussing his ideas. His name was Socrates. Curiously, he never wrote a single book. Not one. Everything we know about him comes from others. Mostly from one devoted student, Plato. Also from the historian Xenophon. And, interestingly enough, from one of his greatest critics, the playwright Aristophanes. Because of this, historians still debate which ideas belong to the historical Socrates, and which may have been developed later by Plato. This question has become so important that it even has its own name: the Socratic problem. It reminds us that history is rarely as simple as we might hope. And perhaps the greatest question of all: how do we become better human beings? These are not ancient questions. They are timeless ones. Tonight, we will walk slowly through the life and philosophy of the man who devoted himself to asking them. Not in search of easy answers, but in search of deeper understanding. Because for Socrates, the quality of our lives depends greatly on the quality of the questions we are willing to ask. And so, our journey is only just beginning. Before we can understand Socrates' philosophy, we must first understand the man himself. Because unlike many philosophers who came after him, Socrates never separated his ideas from the way he lived. His philosophy was not something reserved for special occasions. It was not confined to books, nor was it hidden inside schools. His philosophy walked beside him through the streets of Athens. It appeared in every conversation, every question, every decision. To understand Socrates is to understand a life lived in constant examination. He was born around the year 470 before Christ. During a remarkable period in Greek history, Athens was becoming one of the most influential cities the world had ever seen. Its democracy, though limited by modern standards, encouraged public debate. Artists filled temples with magnificent sculptures. Playwrights wrote tragedies that are still performed today. Architects raised buildings that would inspire civilizations for thousands of years. It was an age of extraordinary confidence. The Athenians believed they stood at the center of the civilized world. Yet beneath this confidence, the city was also deeply uncertain. Wars threatened its future. Political rivalries divided its people. Power shifted constantly between ambitious leaders. Old traditions were questioned. New ideas emerged almost every generation. It was within this vibrant and often unstable world that Socrates grew up. His father, Socrates, was traditionally believed to be a stonemason or sculptor. His mother, Phaedra, worked as a midwife. Although history leaves many details uncertain, these two professions would later become surprisingly symbolic. Stone is slowly shaped through careful work, not by force, but by patience. And a midwife does not create new life. She helps bring into the world what already exists. Years later, Socrates would describe his own method in almost the same way. He often claimed that he did not place knowledge inside other people. Instead, he helped them give birth to ideas they already carried within themselves. He called this approach the art of midwifery, not of the body, but of the mind. Whether inspired directly by his mother's profession or not, the comparison remains one of the most beautiful images in philosophy. Socrates himself probably received the ordinary education expected of an Athenian citizen. He learned music, poetry, physical training, and the traditions of his city. Yet nothing suggests that he was considered extraordinary as a young man. He was not born into great wealth, nor into political power. He never presented himself as someone chosen by destiny. In fact, much of his later influence came precisely because he appeared so ordinary. Unlike famous teachers who charged large fees, Socrates accepted no payment. He believed wisdom should never become a business. This distinguished him from many of the sophists, professional teachers who traveled throughout Greece offering instruction in rhetoric, politics, and public speaking. The sophists were often brilliant. Many genuinely expanded Greek intellectual life. But they were also criticized for teaching people how to win arguments, whether those arguments were true or false. Socrates admired skillful thinking, but he cared even more about truth. For him, winning an argument meant very little if one had lost contact with reality. As a young man, he also served Athens as a soldier. This surprises many people. We often imagine philosophers as quiet scholars who spend their lives surrounded by books. But Socrates knew hardship firsthand. Ancient accounts describe him serving courageously during military campaigns. Several companions later recalled his remarkable endurance. He tolerated hunger better than most soldiers. He endured cold without complaint, while others wrapped themselves in heavy cloaks. Socrates often wore the same simple garments. He could march long distances, sleep outdoors, and remain calm even under danger. His courage was not the loud courage of someone seeking glory. It was quieter than that. More disciplined. He seemed remarkably difficult to disturb. Perhaps this explains why later philosophers, especially the Stoics, saw him as an example of inner strength. Long before Stoicism existed, Socrates already embodied many of the qualities they would later admire: self-control, calmness, resilience, indifference toward luxury, and the conviction that character matters more than comfort. Despite living in one of the richest cultural centers of the ancient world, Socrates himself remained remarkably poor. Not because he lacked opportunities, but because he simply did not organize his life around possessions. He owned very little. He sought no fortune. He spent countless hours talking with strangers instead of pursuing wealth. To many Athenians, this seemed foolish. Surely, a sensible man should focus on his career, his reputation, his income, his family. Yet Socrates appeared strangely unconcerned by these ambitions. He believed there was something infinitely more valuable: the condition of one's soul. If a person accumulated riches, but neglected wisdom, had they truly succeeded? Or had they merely exchanged one form of poverty for another? These questions would become the foundation of everything he taught. And little by little, the streets of Athens began to notice the unusual man who seemed to care less about success and more about truth. Soon, people would begin seeking him out, not because he claimed to have answers, but because he asked questions unlike anyone else. And those questions would change philosophy forever. If you had walked through the Agora on an ordinary afternoon, you might have noticed something curious. A small crowd, not gathered around a politician, nor a famous poet, nor a celebrated general. Instead, a handful of citizens stood in quiet conversation with an older man. There were no speeches, no lectures, no grand performance. Only questions. Simple questions. The kind that almost anyone might answer without hesitation. What is courage? What is justice? What makes someone wise? At first, the questions seemed easy. A young man might answer confidently: courage is fighting bravely in battle. Socrates would smile gently: and is a soldier who fights foolishly courageous? The young man would pause. Perhaps not. So courage must be something more than merely fighting. The conversation continued. New definitions appeared. New questions followed. One by one, every answer seemed to reveal another difficulty. What had seemed obvious only moments before slowly became uncertain. This was no accident. It was exactly what Socrates intended. Unlike many teachers, he did not begin by offering answers. He began by uncovering assumptions. He believed that most people lived with opinions they had never truly examined. They inherited ideas from parents, friends, tradition, or society, then spent the rest of their lives defending those ideas, without ever asking whether they were actually true. Socrates found this deeply troubling. Not because he wished to embarrass people, but because he believed genuine wisdom begins only when we recognize the limits of our own understanding. This approach later became known as the Socratic Method. Although modern classrooms often use the term broadly, the original practice was far more personal. It was not a technique for winning debates. Nor was it a clever way to trap another person. It was a shared search for truth, one question at a time. Imagine standing beside him. He might ask, "What is honesty?" You answer, "Honesty means telling the truth." A simple answer. Reasonable. Almost everyone would agree. But Socrates might continue. Is telling the truth always honest? Suppose a violent man arrives at your home, searching for an innocent person hiding inside. He asks if they are there. Would telling the truth still be the honest thing to do? Suddenly, a definition that seemed perfectly clear no longer feels complete. So you refine it. Perhaps honesty also requires wisdom. Socrates nods. And what is wisdom? Once again, the conversation begins. Notice what is happening. He is not trying to prove himself superior. He is helping another person discover that reality is often more subtle than it first appears. Every answer becomes another doorway. Every certainty becomes another question. Some people found this exhilarating. Others found it exhausting. Many found it deeply uncomfortable. Because nothing threatens the human ego quite like discovering that we may not know what we thought we knew. This is why Socrates often began with a kind of gentle irony. Today, scholars call it Socratic irony. He would present himself as someone who genuinely wished to learn. Instead of declaring, "You are wrong," he might simply say, "I don't understand. Could you explain what you mean?" It sounded humble. And it was. But it also encouraged the other person to think more carefully. Eventually, contradictions would begin to appear. Not because Socrates created them, but because they had been there all along. This stage of the conversation is often called the elenchus, a Greek word usually translated as examination, refutation, or cross-examination. Its purpose was never humiliation. Its purpose was clarity. Imagine cleaning a beautiful window that has been covered with dust for many years. The dirt is not the window. But until it is removed, you cannot clearly see through it. For Socrates, false beliefs were like that dust. Before truth could enter, error had to leave. This explains why many conversations with Socrates ended without a final answer. Modern readers sometimes find this frustrating. They expect philosophy to provide conclusions. Instead, Socrates often left people with better questions than the ones they had brought. To him, that was progress. Because an honest question was infinitely more valuable than a confident mistake. There was another image Socrates loved, perhaps the most beautiful of all. He compared himself to a midwife. His own mother had helped women bring children into the world. Socrates believed he did something remarkably similar. Except, he helped people give birth to understanding. He insisted that wisdom could not simply be handed from one person to another. No lecture, no book, no speech could place genuine understanding inside another human being. Each person had to discover it for themselves. His role was simply to help, to ask, to guide, to encourage, to remove confusion, until understanding emerged naturally, like the first light of dawn. This idea, known as maieutic, or the art of intellectual midwifery, would influence education for centuries. Even today, Many of the world's greatest teachers rely less on giving answers, and more on asking thoughtful questions. Because information can be memorized, but understanding must be discovered. And perhaps that is why, more than 2,000 years later, the questions of Socrates still feel strangely alive. Not because he told humanity what to think, but because he taught us how to think. What does it mean to know? After spending time with Socrates, many people walked away with an unexpected feeling. Not certainty, but uncertainty. They arrived convinced they understood the world. They left realizing how much remained unexplored. At first, this may seem like failure. After all, shouldn't philosophy provide answers? Shouldn't wisdom make everything clearer? Socrates would likely smile at those questions, because he believed that recognizing our ignorance is often the first genuine step toward knowledge. Imagine a person standing in complete darkness. If they believe they can already see perfectly, they will never search for light. But the moment they admit, "I cannot see clearly," everything changes. Only then do they begin looking. For Socrates, this simple act of admitting ignorance was not weakness. It was courage. Perhaps one of the greatest forms of courage. There is an old story connected to his life, one that became central to his reputation. According to Plato's Apology, a friend of Socrates visited the famous oracle at Delphi. This oracle was considered one of the most sacred places in all of Greece. People traveled enormous distances seeking guidance from the god Apollo. Socrates' friend asked a remarkable question. "Is anyone wiser than Socrates?" The priestess answered, "No one." When Socrates heard this, he was puzzled. He did not celebrate. He did not declare himself the greatest philosopher in Greece. Instead, he doubted the oracle. How could he be the wisest when he constantly felt aware of how little he knew? Rather than accepting the answer, he decided to investigate. He began speaking with politicians, poets, craftsmen, military leaders, respected citizens, people widely admired for their intelligence. One after another, he discovered something surprising. Many possess genuine knowledge in one area. A skilled craftsman truly understood his craft. A poet understood rhythm and language. A general understood warfare. But somewhere along the way, many had made a subtle mistake. Because they were experts in one thing, they assumed they were wise in everything. Socrates noticed this pattern again and again. Knowledge in one field had quietly transformed into overconfidence. And overconfidence had become blindness. Eventually, he reached a curious conclusion. Perhaps the oracle had been right after all. Not because he possessed extraordinary knowledge, but because he alone recognized the limits of his own understanding. This idea has often been summarized by the famous sentence, "I know that I know nothing." It is one of the best-known phrases in all of philosophy. And yet, there is something important we should understand. Those exact words do not appear in Plato's surviving dialogues as a direct quotation from Socrates. Instead, they capture the spirit of his attitude. A better way to understand his position might be this: I do not pretend to know what I do not know. It is a subtle difference, but a profound one. Socrates was not claiming complete ignorance. He obviously knew many things. He recognized people. He served in the army. He understood everyday life. What he rejected was the illusion of certainty, especially about life's deepest questions. Justice, goodness, beauty, the soul, happiness. These subjects demanded humility, not arrogance. Even today, modern psychology has uncovered something remarkably similar. Researchers have repeatedly observed that people with limited knowledge often overestimate their understanding, while those who become true experts usually become more aware of how much remains unknown. The more we learn, the larger the horizon becomes. And the larger the horizon, the more we realize there is still to discover. Socrates understood this over 2,000 years ago. Without laboratories, without neuroscience, without modern psychology, simply by observing people, patiently, carefully, honestly. This is why self-knowledge occupied such a central place in his philosophy. Above the entrance to the temple of Apollo at Delphi were carved two simple words: know thyself. Although Socrates did not invent this saying, few people embodied it more completely. To know yourself did not simply mean knowing your favorite food, or your talents, or your personality. It meant recognizing your fears, your desires, your prejudices, your weaknesses, your hidden motivations. It meant asking difficult questions. Why do I believe this? Why does this opinion matter so much to me? Am I defending the truth, or merely protecting my pride? These questions are rarely comfortable. Even today, perhaps especially today, our world often encourages certainty, quick opinions, immediate conclusions, instant confidence. Social media rewards certainty. Television rewards certainty. Politics rewards certainty. But Socrates invites us toward something very different. Curiosity, patience, humility, the willingness to say, I may be mistaken. Far from making us weaker, this openness makes genuine learning possible. Because wisdom, in the Socratic sense, is not a collection of facts. It is a lifelong relationship with truth. A relationship built not upon pretending to know everything, but upon never losing the courage to keep asking. And it is from this humble beginning, this recognition that we always have more to learn, that one of Socrates' greatest ideas naturally emerges. If knowledge shapes our understanding, then perhaps knowledge also shapes the way we live. And that question will lead us directly into the heart of his ethics. Now, we arrive at one of the most important ideas in all of Socrates' philosophy. If we could ask him a single question, perhaps it would be this: what makes a person truly good? Notice, not successful, not famous, not powerful, but good. Today, many different answers might come to mind. Some people would point to wealth, others to kindness, others to intelligence, or generosity, or courage. Socrates listened carefully to all these possibilities, but he believed they all pointed toward something deeper. A single idea that the ancient Greeks called arete. usually translated as virtue. Yet this English word does not fully capture what the Greeks meant. When we hear the word virtue today, we often imagine someone who follows rules. Someone polite, respectable, morally upright. The Greek idea was richer than that. Arete meant excellence, fulfilling one's true potential, becoming the very best version of what something was meant to be. Imagine a beautifully crafted violin. Its excellence is not measured by how expensive it is, nor by how beautiful it looks. Its excellence lies in how well it fulfills its purpose. A healthy tree expresses its excellence by growing strong roots, producing leaves, bearing fruit. A horse expresses excellence through strength, grace, and endurance. But what about a human being? What is our excellence? What is our true purpose? This was the question that fascinated Socrates. He believed that our excellence does not come from physical strength, nor beauty, nor social status, nor wealth. It comes from the condition of something far more important: the soul. When Socrates spoke of the soul, he was not necessarily describing it in the same way later religious traditions would. For him, the soul was the deepest part of a person, the seat of reason, character, judgment, moral understanding. It was, in many ways, the person behind the person. And just as the body can become healthy or unhealthy, so too can the soul. A body grows stronger through exercise. The soul grows stronger through wisdom. The body weakens through neglect. The soul weakens through ignorance. For Socrates, this was not merely poetry. It was reality. Every decision we make shapes the condition of our soul. Every honest act strengthens it. Every selfish act changes it. Every lie leaves its mark. Not because someone is watching, not because punishment will necessarily follow, but because every action slowly forms the kind of person we become. Think about that for a moment. We often believe that our actions are separate from our identity. I lied. I acted selfishly. I lost my temper. As though these were isolated moments. Socrates would gently suggest something different. Each action is also a lesson we teach ourselves. Every choice becomes practice. And practice becomes character. Little by little, without even noticing, we become the habits we repeat. This idea would later inspire Aristotle. It would influence the Stoics. It would echo through Christian philosophy. And even modern psychology now recognizes something remarkably similar. Habits shape identity. Repeated behavior changes the brain. Character is built through repetition. More than 2,000 years ago, Socrates had already sensed this truth. But perhaps his most surprising belief was this. He argued that no one willingly chooses evil. At first, this sounds almost impossible. Surely, history gives us countless examples of cruelty, violence, greed, betrayal. How could anyone claim that people do not willingly do wrong? To understand Socrates, we must slow down. He did not deny that terrible actions exist. He saw injustice all around him. What he questioned was the reason people commit them. Suppose someone lies. Why? Perhaps to gain money, to avoid embarrassment, to protect themselves, to obtain power. In every case, the person believes that lying will somehow make life better. They may be mistaken, deeply mistaken, but at that moment, they believe they are pursuing something they consider good. The mistake lies in their understanding, not merely in their action. Socrates believed that if a person truly understood, not intellectually, but deeply, what genuine goodness really is, they could not deliberately choose its opposite. Because every human being naturally seeks what they believe will lead to a better life. When people choose badly, it is because they misunderstand what better truly means. This idea is often called Socratic intellectualism. Knowledge and virtue cannot be separated. To know the good is to love the good. To love the good is to practice it. This does not mean learning facts. One may memorize every philosophy book ever written and still fail to become wise. The knowledge Socrates speaks of is transformative understanding. The kind of understanding that changes how a person sees the world. Like someone who finally realizes that fire burns. Once truly understood, there is no temptation to touch it carelessly again. For Socrates, wisdom works in much the same way. When the soul genuinely sees what is good, it naturally moves toward it. This is why education mattered so deeply to him. Not education as the accumulation of information, but education as the transformation of character. The purpose of learning was never simply to know more. It was to become better. And from this remarkable idea, another question naturally emerges. If virtue leads us toward the good, what does that actually look like in everyday life? How should we treat other people? What is justice? What is courage? What is self-control? What does it truly mean to live well? Those questions will guide the next stage of our journey. If knowledge leads to virtue, then another question naturally follows. How does a virtuous person actually live? It is one thing to speak about wisdom. It is another thing entirely to practice it. For Socrates, philosophy was never meant to remain inside conversation. Its true purpose was to shape everyday life. Every decision, every relationship, every promise, every difficult moment. These were the places where philosophy revealed its true value. Because ideas, however beautiful, mean very little if they never change the person who holds them. Imagine someone who spends years studying medicine, reading every book, memorizing every illness, learning every treatment. But when faced with a patient, they refuse to help. Could we truly call that person a physician? Probably not. Knowledge that never becomes action remains incomplete. Socrates believed the same was true of wisdom. To know what is good is ultimately to live what is good. And so, he spent much of his life asking questions about the qualities that define an excellent human being. Not extraordinary qualities, not heroic qualities, but the virtues that shape ordinary life. Again and again, his conversations returned to the same themes: justice, courage, self-control, piety, friendship, honesty, responsibility. These words were familiar to every Athenian. Yet Socrates noticed something surprising. Almost everyone used them. Very few could explain them. Take justice. Ask someone today, "What is justice?" Many would answer immediately, "Justice means obeying the law." It sounds reasonable. But Socrates would probably ask, what if the law itself is unjust? History offers countless examples. There have been laws permitting slavery, laws denying basic human rights, laws protecting corruption. If justice were simply obedience, would every law automatically become just? Surely not. Then perhaps justice must be something deeper than law. Maybe law should strive toward justice, rather than define it. Socrates did not provide easy formulas. Instead, he encouraged people to continue examining their assumptions. Little by little, justice became less about external rules, and more about the condition of the soul. A just person acts justly because injustice damages the person who commits it, even when no one is watching. This was one of his most radical ideas. Most people fear injustice because of punishment. Socrates feared injustice because it corrupts character. Imagine two people. One steals and is never discovered. The other remains honest despite having every opportunity to cheat. From the outside, the thief appears successful. But Socrates asks us to look somewhere else. Not at the money, not at the reputation, but at the soul. Which person has become stronger? Which person has become freer? Which person has cultivated excellence? His answer was always the same. The truly successful life cannot be measured only by external achievements. It must also be measured by the kind of person we are becoming. The same careful questioning appears when Socrates discusses courage. Most people imagine courage as fearlessness. A soldier charging into battle. Someone who never hesitates. But Socrates challenges this image. Is someone courageous if they rush into danger without understanding the risks? Or is that simply recklessness? Imagine two sailors caught in a violent storm. One ignores every warning. He sails forward without thinking. The other studies the wind, understands the danger, and acts carefully despite feeling afraid. Which one displays true courage? For Socrates, courage was never the absence of fear. It was intelligent endurance. The ability to act rightly, despite fear. Knowledge once again becomes essential. Without wisdom, courage easily becomes recklessness. Without courage, wisdom remains inactive. Each virtue supports the others. None can fully exist alone. This idea extends naturally to self-control, or what the Greeks called temperance. Modern culture often celebrates unlimited desire. More success, more possessions, more attention, more entertainment, more consumption. Socrates looked in another direction. He asked a much quieter question. Who is truly free? The person who can satisfy every desire? Or the person who has learned to govern their desires? Imagine owning a magnificent palace, yet never feeling satisfied. Always wanting something larger, something newer, something more impressive. Now imagine another person, living with far less, yet experiencing deep contentment. Who possesses greater freedom? For Socrates, freedom did not begin with external circumstances. It began with mastery of oneself. A person ruled by every impulse is not truly free, even if the entire world envies them. The same principle appears in his reflections on friendship. A genuine friend is not simply someone who agrees with us, nor someone who flatters us. A true friend helps us become better. Someone willing to tell uncomfortable truths. Someone who values our character more than our approval. This explains why many conversations with Socrates felt surprisingly demanding. He challenged those he cared about, not because he wished to criticize them, but because he believed friendship should elevate both people. Real friendship was a shared pursuit of virtue, not merely shared entertainment. And perhaps this is one of the most timeless lessons he offers. The people around us quietly shape the people we become. Every conversation influences us. Every friendship teaches us something. Every community forms habits of thought. For that reason, choosing companions is also choosing the direction of our own character. Little by little, without realizing it, we begin resembling those with whom we spend our lives. For Socrates, living well was never a matter of chance. It was the result of thousands of small choices. Each honest conversation, each act of courage, each moment of self-restraint, each pursuit of truth. Together, they shaped the soul. And among all the questions that guided his life, one remained quietly at the center of everything. Why do human beings seek all these virtues in the first place? What is the final goal? What are justice, courage, wisdom, and self-control ultimately meant to achieve? The answer leads us to one of the oldest questions humanity has ever asked. What does it truly mean to live a happy life? If you were to ask people today, what do you want most in life? The answers would probably sound familiar. Happiness, peace, success, love, security, a meaningful life. Although the words may differ, they all seem to point toward the same destination. Every human being, in one way or another, is searching for a life that feels truly worth living. The ancient Greeks had a beautiful word for this idea: eudaimonia. It is often translated simply as happiness. But much like the word virtue, the translation is incomplete. When we hear the word happiness today, we often think of emotion. Feeling good, feeling excited, feeling satisfied. For Socrates, eudaimonia meant something much deeper. It was not merely a pleasant feeling. It was a flourishing life. A life in which the human being fulfills their highest potential. Imagine an oak tree. Its purpose is not merely to survive, nor simply to remain standing. It flourishes when it grows strong, extends its branches, produces leaves, provides shade, and bears fruit. Its excellence is found in becoming fully what it was meant to be. Socrates believed the same principle applied to us. Human beings flourish, not when they possess the most, but when they become the best version of themselves. This changes everything. Because if happiness depends upon becoming, rather than possessing, then many of the things we spend our lives chasing begin to look very different. Money, power, recognition, pleasure. None of these are necessarily bad. Socrates never claimed they were. But neither did he believe they could guarantee a good life. Imagine someone who possesses enormous wealth. Their home is magnificent. Their influence reaches thousands. Their name is admired by society. Yet inside, they are consumed by envy, fear, dishonesty, restlessness. Would we truly call such a person happy? Now imagine another individual. They live simply. Their possessions are few. Few people know their name. Yet they are honest, kind, wise. Their conscience is peaceful. Their friendships are genuine. Their character remains steady through both success and hardship. Which life is richer? Socrates knew that most people would instinctively choose the first, because the eyes are easily impressed. But philosophy asks us to look deeper, beyond appearances, toward the condition of the soul. For Socrates, a damaged soul can never produce a flourishing life. No amount of wealth can compensate for dishonesty. No amount of pleasure can replace wisdom. No amount of fame can heal a corrupted character. This idea remains surprisingly challenging today. Modern culture often suggests that happiness lies just beyond the next achievement. After the promotion. After buying the house. After earning more money. After gaining more followers. After becoming more successful. The destination always seems one step further away. Socrates gently interrupts this endless pursuit. He asks a remarkably simple question. What kind of person will you become while chasing these things? It is possible, he suggests, to gain the entire world, while quietly losing yourself. And if that happens, what has truly been gained? One of the most fascinating aspects of Socratic philosophy is that happiness cannot be separated from morality. Today, many people think of ethics and happiness as different subjects. Ethics tells us what we ought to do. Happiness tells us what we want to feel. Socrates believed they were inseparable. The person who lives virtuously lives well. Not because virtue guarantees comfort. Not because life becomes easy. But because virtue brings harmony to the soul. Imagine an orchestra. Every instrument perfectly tuned. Every musician listening carefully to the others. The result is harmony. Now imagine that same orchestra. Each instrument playing independently. Ignoring rhythm. Ignoring one another. The result is noise. Socrates believed the human soul worked in much the same way. When reason, character, desires, and actions move together, life becomes harmonious. When they conflict, inner turmoil begins. Many people know this feeling. Saying one thing, while believing another. Knowing the right decision, yet choosing differently. Seeking approval instead of truth. Little by little, the soul becomes divided. And division can never produce peace. This is why Socrates cared so deeply about consistency. The wise person thinks well, speaks honestly, acts justly, not because perfection is possible, but because integrity creates unity within oneself. There is another lesson quietly hidden here, perhaps one that becomes even more meaningful with age. Socrates reminds us that happiness is not something we accidentally discover. It is something we patiently cultivate. Like a garden, every thoughtful conversation plants another seed. Every honest decision waters the soil. Every act of courage strengthens the roots. Character grows slowly, almost invisibly, until one day, looking back, we realize we have become someone different. Someone calmer. Someone wiser. Someone less controlled by fear. Perhaps that is one of the greatest gifts philosophy can offer. Not immediate answers. Not instant transformation. But a better direction. A way of walking through life. One step at a time. And yet, as deeply as Socrates believed in virtue, his ideas would eventually place him in direct conflict with the very city he loved. The same man who spent decades encouraging Athenians to think more carefully would one day stand before them, accused of corrupting their youth, and sentenced to death. To understand why, we must now turn to one of the most remarkable trials in human history. For nearly 70 years, Socrates walked the streets of Athens. Day after day, conversation after conversation, question after question. He never led an army. He never sought political power. He never attempted to rule the city. Yet, few individuals influenced Athens more profoundly than he did. Not everyone appreciated his influence. To many young Athenians, Socrates represented intellectual freedom. He encouraged them to think for themselves, to question assumptions, to examine traditions, to seek truth rather than popularity. But to others, especially those whose authority depended upon certainty, his questions felt dangerous. After all, a society built upon unquestioned beliefs often becomes uncomfortable when someone begins asking difficult questions. This discomfort had been growing for many years. Athens itself had also changed. The city that once celebrated confidence and democracy had suffered greatly. The long Peloponnesian War against Sparta lasted for nearly 3 decades. It exhausted the city. Thousands died. Resources disappeared. Political instability became common. At one point, Athens even fell under the control of an oppressive oligarchic government known as the 30 Tyrants. Although democracy was eventually restored, the wounds remained fresh. The city was searching for stability, for someone to trust, for someone to blame. History often teaches us that after periods of fear and uncertainty, societies become suspicious of voices that challenge accepted ideas. And few people questioned accepted ideas more persistently than Socrates. Eventually, formal accusations were brought against him. 3 men stood among his principal accusers: Meletus, Anytus, and Lycon. Together, they presented charges that would change the course of philosophical history. The official accusations were surprisingly simple. First, that Socrates did not properly acknowledge the traditional gods of Athens. And second, that he corrupted the youth. At first glance, these charges may sound straightforward, but beneath them lay something much deeper. Was Socrates truly guilty of impiety? Or was he guilty of encouraging independent thought? Was he corrupting young people? Or teaching them to think critically? Even today, historians continue discussing these questions. Perhaps the accusations were sincere. Perhaps they were politically motivated. Perhaps they reflected years of frustration from those who had been embarrassed during conversations with him. Reality, like so much of history, is rarely simple. The trial itself took place before a large jury of Athenian citizens. Unlike modern courtrooms, there was no professional judge deciding the verdict. Hundreds of ordinary citizens listened to both sides before casting their votes. Socrates now stood before the very city he had spent his life trying to improve. Many people in his position would have attempted to flatter the jury, to beg for mercy, to promise change. Socrates did none of these things. Instead, he spoke with the same calm honesty that had guided his entire life. His defense, preserved for us primarily in Plato's Apology, remains one of the greatest speeches in the history of philosophy. He did not claim perfection. He did not pretend to possess complete knowledge. But he insisted upon one thing. He had never intentionally harmed anyone. Everything he had done had been motivated by a sincere desire to encourage wisdom and virtue. He compared himself to something rather unexpected. A gadfly. A small insect. Athens, he suggested, was like a magnificent but sluggish horse. Powerful. Beautiful. Yet in danger of becoming complacent. The gadfly, though tiny, keeps the horse awake. It disturbs. It irritates. It refuses to allow comfortable sleep. Socrates believed that this had been his role. Not to destroy Athens, but to awaken it. To prevent the city from becoming satisfied with shallow thinking. To remind its citizens that an unexamined life is a dangerous life. This famous sentence, "The unexamined life is not worth living," appears in Plato's account of the trial. It has become one of the most influential statements in the entire history of philosophy. Notice what Socrates is saying. He is not arguing that every life must become academic, nor that everyone must study philosophy professionally. He means something quieter. A life spent drifting from habit to habit, never questioning one's beliefs, never examining one's character, never asking whether one is becoming wiser, misses something essential about being human. To examine life is to remain awake. Awake to our choices, our motives, our fears, our values. Awake to the possibility that we may still have something to learn. The jury listened. Arguments were presented. Votes were cast. When the counting ended, Socrates had been found guilty. The margin appears to have been relatively narrow. Had only a small number of jurors changed their minds, history might have unfolded very differently. According to Athenian custom, both the prosecution and the defendant could now propose a penalty. The jury would choose between them. His accusers demanded death. Many expected Socrates to propose exile or a fine. Instead, his response revealed everything about the man he had always been. With quiet irony, he remarked that, if anything, he deserved to be rewarded for his service to Athens, not punished. Eventually, he did suggest paying a modest fine, encouraged by friends who offered financial support. But by then, the jury's patience had largely disappeared. The final vote was cast. The sentence was death. The man who had spent decades encouraging people to think more carefully would soon drink a cup of poison. Not because he had led a rebellion, not because he had committed violence, but because he had spent a lifetime asking questions. Yet perhaps the most extraordinary chapter of this story was still to come. Because after receiving the sentence, Socrates was offered something that many believed no reasonable person would refuse: the opportunity to escape. After the trial, Athens slowly returned to its ordinary rhythm. The marketplace reopened. Merchants continued selling their goods. Children played in the streets. The city carried on, as cities always do. But inside a small prison cell, one man waited. The execution would not happen immediately. According to Athenian religious custom, a sacred ship had recently departed for the island of Delos. While that ship remained at sea, no executions could take place. And so, for several weeks, Socrates remained imprisoned. His friends visited him often. They brought food, conversation, comfort, and above all, hope. Because there was still another possibility: escape. To modern ears, it may seem obvious. Surely an innocent man should flee. Surely preserving one's life is the highest priority. Many of Socrates' closest companions believed exactly that. One friend in particular, Crito, worked carefully to arrange everything. The prison guards could be bribed. Safe passage could be organized. Friends in other cities were prepared to welcome Socrates. He would lose his home, but he would keep his life. It seemed like the only reasonable choice. One morning, Crito entered the prison before sunrise. The city was still quiet. Most Athenians remained asleep. Inside the cell, he found Socrates resting peacefully, not pacing, not trembling, not consumed by fear, sleeping as calmly as though nothing extraordinary were about to happen. When Socrates awoke, Crito pleaded with him. He argued from every possible angle. Your friends will be blamed if you stay. People will think we failed to help you. Your children need their father. Your students need their teacher. The verdict was unjust. You owe nothing to those who condemned you. Leave. Live. Continue teaching elsewhere. It was a persuasive argument. Perhaps many of us would have accepted it immediately. But Socrates did something entirely characteristic. He did not begin by answering. He began by asking questions. What is the right thing to do? Should injustice be answered with another injustice? If a court acts wrongly, does that give us permission to ignore every law? Slowly, patiently, the conversation unfolded. Socrates argued that throughout his entire life, he had accepted the laws of Athens. He had chosen to remain there. He had raised his family there. He had benefited from its protections. If he now rejected the law, simply because it no longer favored him, would he not be acting according to convenience, rather than principle? Notice carefully. He was not claiming the verdict was correct. He knew the decision had been unjust. But he distinguished between two different things: an unjust decision and the destruction of justice itself. If every citizen obeyed the law only when it benefited them, could any society survive? These questions remain difficult even today. Modern philosophers continue debating them. Some argue that unjust laws deserve resistance. Others believe social order requires obedience. Socrates does not offer an easy formula. Instead, he shows remarkable consistency. He asks himself the very same question he had asked others for decades. What action preserves the integrity of my soul? Everything else came second. Not reputation, not comfort, not even life itself. For Socrates, a damaged soul was a greater tragedy than a dead body, because the body eventually dies regardless. But character is formed by every decision we make along the way. This is perhaps one of the most radical ideas in all of philosophy. Imagine being offered complete freedom at the cost of abandoning your deepest principles. Would you accept? Most people hope they would remain faithful to their values, but very few ever face such a choice. Socrates did, and his answer never changed. He refused to escape, not because he feared death, but because he feared becoming someone different from the person he had spent his entire life trying to become. He had taught that virtue matters more than success. Now, he had the opportunity to prove whether he truly believed it. Many philosophers have written beautiful words. Many leaders have delivered inspiring speeches. Many teachers have explained noble ideals. But there is something uniquely powerful about watching someone live exactly as they taught, even when doing so demands the greatest possible sacrifice. Perhaps this explains why Socrates continues inspiring people after more than 2,000 years. His philosophy was never merely theoretical. It was visible. Visible in his conversations. Visible in his humility. Visible in his courage. And now, visible in the quiet acceptance of his own fate. The day eventually arrived. The sacred ship returned. The waiting was over. Soon, a cup containing a simple mixture of poison would bring one of history's greatest philosophical lives to its peaceful conclusion. And yet, even in his final hours, Socrates would continue teaching, not through arguments, but through the extraordinary calm with which he faced death itself. The prison was quiet. Outside, Athens continued its ordinary life. People bought bread. Merchants opened their stalls. Children laughed in the streets. The sun rose over the Acropolis, just as it had thousands of times before. History often moves this way. Even extraordinary moments unfold while ordinary life quietly continues around them. Inside the prison, Socrates spent his final hours surrounded by friends. Many of them struggled to accept what was happening. Some wept openly. Others sat in silence, unable to imagine a world without the man who had shaped their lives so profoundly. Among them was Plato. Or at least, so tradition tells us. In one of history's most beautiful philosophical works, the dialogue known as Phaedo, Plato describes the final conversation before Socrates' death. Whether every detail happened exactly as written, historians cannot know with certainty. But the dialogue captures something essential: the extraordinary peace with which Socrates faced the end of his life. He did not spend his last hours speaking about revenge, nor about politics, nor about the men who had condemned him. Instead, he continued doing what he had always done: asking questions, exploring ideas, reflecting on the nature of the soul. It is difficult to imagine a man only hours away from death, choosing philosophy over anger, curiosity over bitterness, conversation over despair. Perhaps this was the greatest lesson Socrates ever taught. Not through words, but through example. One of the subjects discussed that day was whether death should truly be feared. For Socrates, Fear often arises from pretending to know what we do not know. Many people fear death because they assume it is the greatest evil. But how can anyone know that? None of us has experienced it. Perhaps death is simply dreamless sleep, a peaceful rest beyond every anxiety. Or perhaps it is the beginning of another journey, a place where one might continue questioning, learning, and conversing with those who came before. Socrates did not claim certainty. Once again, he remained faithful to the humility that had guided his entire life. He admitted what he did not know, but he refused to fear what no one could truly understand. Eventually, the prison guard entered. In his hands, he carried a simple cup. Inside, a drink prepared from hemlock, a poisonous plant commonly used for executions in Athens. Ancient accounts describe the guard as reluctant. Some even suggest he had grown to admire Socrates during the weeks of imprisonment. He explained calmly what would happen. Drink the poison. Walk until your legs grow heavy. Then lie down. The numbness would slowly move upward through the body, until the heart finally became still. There would be no violence, no struggle, only a gradual quieting of the body. Socrates accepted the cup without hesitation, without trembling, without resistance, without hatred. Those around him found this almost impossible to bear. Several began crying. Socrates gently reminded them to remain calm. He had spent his entire life preparing the soul to meet truth. Why should the final moment be different? He raised the cup, drank it completely, and handed it back. There is something almost unimaginable about that moment. Not because he welcomed death, but because he refused to betray everything he believed simply to avoid it. Little by little, his legs became heavy. He lay down. The numbness slowly climbed upward. Friends touched his feet, then his legs. As sensation disappeared, the body gradually became still. According to Plato's account, his final recorded words were directed toward one of his closest friends. Crito, we owe a rooster to Asclepius. Please, do not forget to pay the debt. The meaning of these words has fascinated scholars for centuries. Asclepius was the Greek god of healing. Why would a dying philosopher speak of offering thanks to the god of medicine? No one knows with certainty. Some believe Socrates meant that death itself had become a kind of healing. A release from ignorance. A release from the burdens of earthly life. Others interpret the words differently. Perhaps they simply reflected an unpaid promise. Perhaps they carried symbolic meaning that has now been lost to history. Once again, the honest answer is beautifully Socratic. We cannot know for certain. And perhaps that uncertainty itself is appropriate. Because throughout his life, Socrates taught us not to cling too tightly to certainty where evidence remains incomplete. With those final words, one of history's greatest philosophers died. He left behind no books, no written system, no ground philosophical treatise, no carefully organized collection of doctrines. Only conversations, questions, memories, and students. Among those students, one young man would ensure that Socrates' voice would never truly disappear. His name was Plato. Without Plato, the world might never have known Socrates. Without Socrates, there might never have been the philosophy of Plato. Without Plato, there would have been no Aristotle. Without Aristotle, the intellectual history of Europe, the Middle East, and much of the modern world would look unimaginably different. It is astonishing to consider a man who owned almost nothing, who wrote nothing, who never founded a school, would become one of the most influential human beings who ever lived. Not through wealth, not through political power, not through military conquest, but through conversation, through questions, and through an unwavering commitment to the pursuit of truth. Yet, his influence did not end with Plato. In many ways, it was only beginning. For the question Socrates asked in the streets of Athens would continue echoing through philosophy, science, education, religion, and even modern psychology for more than 2,000 years. When a great empire falls, its borders disappear, its armies vanish, its monuments slowly become ruins. History moves forward. Time carries everything away. But ideas sometimes follow a different path. Ideas can survive the collapse of kingdoms. They can outlive languages. They can cross continents and quietly reshape civilizations that their creators could never have imagined. Socrates understood this, even if he never lived to witness it. When he drank the cup of hemlock, his body remained in Athens. But his questions began a journey that has never truly ended. The first person to carry those questions forward was Plato. Still a relatively young man, Plato had watched his teacher stand before the Athenian court. He had seen a city condemn one of its wisest citizens, and that experience changed him forever. Rather than allowing Socrates to disappear into history, Plato devoted much of his own life to preserving those conversations. Almost everything we know about Socrates comes through Plato's dialogues. They are unlike ordinary philosophy books. Instead of presenting lists of ideas, they invite us into conversations. We watch people disagree. We watch assumptions collapse. We watch understanding slowly emerge. In many ways, reading Plato feels remarkably similar to standing beside Socrates in the agora. Listening, questioning, thinking. Years later, one of Plato's own students would continue this remarkable chain. His name was Aristotle. Although Aristotle eventually disagreed with his teacher on many important questions, the influence of Socrates remained unmistakable. The commitment to reason, the search for definitions, the careful examination of ideas, the belief that philosophy should help us understand how to live. All of these threads continued, like roots spreading beneath the surface. From Socrates to Plato, from Plato to Aristotle, and from Aristotle to countless generations that followed. Centuries later, another group of philosophers would discover something deeply inspiring in the life of Socrates. The Stoics. Thinkers such as Epictetus, Seneca, and Marcus Aurelius admired him enormously, not because he claimed to know everything, but because he demonstrated extraordinary mastery over himself. He showed that external events, though often beyond our control, need not determine the condition of our inner life. This idea became one of the foundations of Stoicism. You cannot always control what happens, but you can cultivate wisdom, character, judgment, and integrity. In many ways, the calm acceptance with which Socrates faced his own death became one of the earliest and greatest examples of Stoic philosophy, even though Stoicism itself would only emerge generations later. His influence extended far beyond philosophy. Modern education still carries traces of his method. The best teachers rarely tell students exactly what to think. Instead, they ask questions. Questions that encourage curiosity. Questions that reveal assumptions. Questions that awaken independent thought. A good teacher, like Socrates, does not simply transfer information. They help another person discover understanding for themselves. The same principle appears throughout modern science. Science advances not by defending certainty, but by questioning it. Every important discovery begins with someone willing to ask, "What if we are mistaken?" This attitude, the willingness to challenge assumptions, to test beliefs, to follow evidence wherever it leads, has something profoundly Socratic about it. Even psychology, a field that did not exist in ancient Greece, often returns to themes that Socrates would have recognized. Self-awareness, reflection, examining unconscious assumptions, understanding our own patterns of thought. Many forms of modern therapy begin not by giving answers, but by asking thoughtful questions. Questions remarkably similar to those once heard beneath the open sky of Athens. Why do you believe this? What evidence supports it? Could there be another way of seeing the situation? Once again, the method survives, even if its origin is often forgotten. Perhaps the greatest surprise of all is how familiar Socrates still feels. More than 24 centuries separate our lives from his. The world has transformed beyond recognition. We communicate across oceans in seconds. We explore distant planets. We carry libraries inside our pockets. Yet despite all this progress, human nature remains astonishingly familiar. We still struggle with pride. We still seek approval. We still fear uncertainty. We still confuse confidence with wisdom. We still argue more easily than we listen. And we still search, as Socrates once searched, for a life that is genuinely good. Perhaps that explains why his philosophy never grows old. He was never trying to explain only ancient Greece. He was trying to understand the human condition itself. And the human condition has changed far less than our technology. Even today, if Socrates were somehow to walk through one of our cities, he might ask us exactly the same questions he asked the Athenians. What is success? What is justice? What does it mean to live well? What kind of person are you becoming? And perhaps, most importantly, have you examined your life? There may never be final answers to these questions. But perhaps that was never the point. Perhaps philosophy, at its highest, is not about ending the conversation. It is about making the conversation worth having. And in that sense, Socrates never truly left us. Because every time someone chooses curiosity over certainty, truth over pride, reflection over impulse, the quiet voice of the old philosopher can still be heard. Not giving answers, but asking one more question. And now, our journey through ancient Athens begins to draw gently toward its end. The marketplace grows quieter. The conversations become fewer. The warmth of the afternoon slowly gives way to the soft colors of evening. The marble buildings, which only hours ago reflected the bright Mediterranean sun, now glow with gentle shades of gold, amber, and deep blue. The city exhales. Merchants close their stalls. The footsteps become less hurried. The voices drift farther into the distance. And somewhere, almost unnoticed, an old philosopher continues walking. Not because history demands it. Not because anyone is watching. But because asking questions has simply become the way he lives. Perhaps that is the most remarkable thing about Socrates. He never claimed to possess extraordinary gifts. He never described himself as wiser than everyone else. He never asked people to admire him. He only invited them to pause, to think, to notice, to examine. It sounds almost unbelievably simple. Yet, few things are more difficult. Our lives move quickly. Each day brings another responsibility, another message, another deadline, another distraction. The modern world rarely rewards silence. It rarely rewards patience. And it almost never rewards uncertainty. We are encouraged to answer immediately, to react instantly, to appear confident, to speak before reflecting, to decide before understanding. Perhaps, without realizing it, we have become very efficient at collecting information, but less practiced at cultivating wisdom. Socrates might gently remind us that these are not the same thing. Knowledge fills the mind. Wisdom shapes the person. One can memorize thousands of facts and still fail to understand oneself. One can accumulate endless information while never asking, what kind of human being am I becoming? This question quietly follows us through every stage of life. It follows us when we are young, searching for identity. It follows us during our careers, when ambition grows louder than reflection. It follows us as parents, as friends, as partners, as neighbors. And it remains with us, even in old age, not demanding an immediate answer, only asking that we continue listening. Perhaps that is why the philosophy of Socrates feels strangely peaceful. It does not require perfection. It does not ask us to become someone else overnight. It simply invites us to become a little more honest, a little more curious, a little more aware. Imagine ending each day not by asking, "How much did I accomplish?" but instead, "What did I learn about myself today? Was I patient? When patience was difficult, did I listen more than I spoke? Did I act from wisdom or from impulse? Did I become, even slightly, a kinder person?" These questions have no audience. There are no awards for answering them well. No applause. No public recognition. Only the quiet satisfaction of knowing that your inner life has become a little richer. Little by little. Day after day. Conversation after conversation. Choice after choice. Character is formed. Not through dramatic moments, but through ordinary ones. A thoughtful word. A moment of restraint. An honest apology. The courage to admit, "I was mistaken." Socrates would probably smile at those words. Because perhaps there is no clearer sign of wisdom than the willingness to keep learning. Even now. Especially now. As the evening settles gently over Athens, and the first stars begin appearing above the ancient hills, there is a comforting thought. The questions that shaped one man's life need not burden us. They need only accompany us, like quiet companions, walking beside us as we continue our own journey. And perhaps that is enough. The night has almost arrived. The last traces of sunlight disappear behind the distant hills. The streets of Athens become quieter still. Lanterns begin to glow softly outside simple homes. Families gather for their evening meal. Conversations become quieter. The marketplace, so full of voices only hours ago, now rests beneath the evening sky. And somewhere, in that peaceful silence, it becomes easier to understand something remarkable. Socrates never promised certainty. He never claimed that philosophy could remove every difficulty from life. He never suggested that wisdom would protect us from loss, from disappointment, or from grief. He knew better than anyone that life could be unfair. He had experienced war. He had watched his city suffer. He had stood before judges who misunderstood him. He had accepted a sentence he did not deserve. And yet, none of these things convinced him to abandon the search for truth. Perhaps because he understood something that is easy to forget. Circumstances shape our lives, but they do not have to define our character. There is always a small space between what happens to us and how we choose to respond. That quiet space may be one of the most precious things we possess. It is where honesty is chosen, where courage is born, where compassion quietly appears, where wisdom begins. No one can make those choices for us. No teacher, no philosopher, no book, not even Socrates. He could ask questions. He could challenge assumptions. He could invite reflection. But the journey inward belonged to each individual alone. Perhaps that is why he never wrote his philosophy down. Had he written a great book, people might have memorized its pages. They might have quoted its sentences. They might have admired its beauty. But they could also have mistaken memorization for understanding. Instead, he left behind conversations. Living conversations. Questions that refuse to remain trapped on a page. Questions that continue unfolding inside the minds of those willing to consider them. Even now, as you listen, perhaps one of those questions has quietly stayed with you. Not because anyone asked you to remember it, but because it somehow felt familiar. Maybe it was a question about courage, or friendship, or justice. Perhaps it was simply, what kind of person am I becoming? There is no need to answer tonight. Some questions deserve time. Like seeds resting beneath the soil. They grow quietly, long before we notice the first signs of change. Socrates trusted that process. He believed that genuine understanding cannot be rushed. It arrives gradually. One thoughtful conversation. One honest reflection. One quiet realization at a time. Perhaps, months from now, you will find yourself facing a difficult decision, without realizing why. You may pause for a moment longer before speaking. You may listen more carefully. You may become a little less certain, and a little more curious. You may ask yourself, what is the wisest thing to do? If that happens, then perhaps the conversation with Socrates will not truly have ended. It will simply have continued in another life. Your life. More than 24 centuries have passed since an old philosopher wandered barefoot through the streets of Athens. Empires have risen. Empires have fallen. Languages have changed. Entire civilizations have appeared and disappeared. And still, the quiet footsteps of Socrates seem strangely close. Not because we can hear his voice, but because every generation eventually discovers the same truth. The most important questions are rarely the easiest ones, and the deepest answers are often found not at the end of the journey, but while walking it. As our time together now comes gently to an end, allow yourself one final slow breath. There is nowhere you need to hurry. Nothing you need to solve before sleep. Only this quiet moment, this peaceful evening, and the comforting reminder that wisdom is not a destination reserved for a few extraordinary people. It is a lifelong practice, a habit of paying attention, a willingness to remain humble, a quiet commitment to keep learning, to keep listening, to keep asking. And perhaps that is all Socrates ever hoped to leave behind. Not a system, not a doctrine, not a final answer, but a way of meeting the world with open eyes, an open mind, and an honest heart. Thank you for walking through ancient Athens with me tonight. May your mind remain curious, your heart remain kind, and your questions always lead you a little closer to wisdom. Good night.